Hi, everyone. Can you hear me all right? So it's always interesting for me to come to industry events where I am clearly the outsider parachuting in to talk about a topic where I spend my waking hours. Just to give you a quick backdrop, I've spent the larger part of my career in London. I was at Morgan Stanley and Deutsche Bank on the trading floors, moved over to CME Group, which is the largest derivatives exchange in the world, running their FX and metals markets, got into Bitcoin, ran their digitization group, launched the Bitcoin futures out of CME, and now I spend the greater part of my days wearing two hats. I'm the CEO of the GBBC, which is a Swiss nonprofit focusing on education, blockchain, and advocacy around how do we use this thing to make it useful for society. And then the other hat I wear is I am an entrepreneur, and I've got two startups, one focusing on helping farmers in physical commodities in mainly developing nations and using this technology amongst many others, as well as another one helping artists. So I focus on social impact. But here I'm going to talk about blockchain and aviation. So people have this fanciful idea that we're talking about magic internet money. And I know there's a lot of jokes that go around. And actually, I know also that there is a lot of hype. And unfortunately, because a group of technologists got together and came up with actually groundbreaking work, it's often lost in the media hype and noise. So here's a couple things that I want to just relate to you. With all the fun here, there's actually something very, very, very serious going on, which is data as value, data as money of the future, and what that looks like, things that are digitized, tokenized, as you may have heard. And in that future world where money moves around in a frictionless digital network, what happens? And here's the other thing. This stuff that we talk about, magic internet money, blockchain's much more than that. Blockchain's bedrock was years and years of actual scientific and mathematical work product. Cryptography, distributed systems. These are real sciences that have been in place for decades. And what came along was a confluence of that in the form of Bitcoin. So I'm just going to go over this very quickly because with every audience, it's difficult for me to know who's actually the expert and who's probably hearing it maybe for the first or second time. So let's talk about blockchain as not a payment. Let's talk about it as a transaction between you and I, an agreement, okay? I'm going to thank Standard Chartered here for this example just because they do refer to it as a transaction or an interaction. So we are going to interact, you and I. You and I are going to agree on something, and it doesn't need to be financial. It can actually be on an action, okay? So we're going to agree on that. And what happens here is we use cryptography to secure that. We could just agree with a handshake, but we're actually going to use something that is going to allow us to secure this. We're going to be in a network. And you know who the network is? The network is us in this room. We're all nodes in a network. And we're all participants with a different role. The function you have, the function you have, and the function you have may be very different, or they may be the same. But we're in this network together. Okay, so we're distributed. We're going to broadcast this agreement you and I have just agreed on. It goes out to the network here. And now, the validators in this network will validate whether this agreement is good or not. And based on whatever agreement or consensus mechanism we decide, is it majority rules? Is it 4 out of 7 validators will rule? Whatever that rule is, when we agree, we end up with an agreed transaction that goes into a block. And this is where the blockchain piece is pretty simple. Once something is confirmed and goes into a block, it is then added to a chain, and it is linear. It's time-stamped, and it's brutally, mathematically linear. So one transaction after another, time-stamped and recorded. And once it is, that term you may have heard, immutable, actually becomes true, which is you have it recorded on something that cannot change. And by the way, if you do try to cook the books or monkey around with it, that tampering, and I'm not going to go into the technical details of how that would work, but it would be actually either very expensive or impossible for you to do that, nearly impossible, or it's going to be so that it will be reflected to the entire network, by the way, that someone has tried monkeying around with that particular transaction. And that's the beauty of this. So we've agreed it's been recorded. And you might ask, well, how many blockchains are there? Is it the blockchain? No. It's many blockchains. Unfortunately, we have a plethora of blockchains right now. And I'm sure if any of my technologist friends were in the room, they would lambaste me for only having a couple up here, but this is a select number. Some are public, some are private. And some of you may have heard of this before, public versus private. Some people use the analogy of intranet versus the public internet. It's not exactly right, but it's kind of there. So imagine the private blockchains as the walled gardens. We in this room are all allowed to be in this network. Nobody else outside, for example, would be allowed. That's a permissioned private network. We all know each other, and we're all interacting as trusted parties. The public network, like Bitcoin and Ethereum, completely open. Completely open. Open access. Now I've given you just a rundown of sort of what blockchain is. What is it touching? It's touching every major sector right now. Because we're not talking about just the value of digitization in a frictionless digital world. We're talking about in industries where you need transparency. And by the way, I heard this morning, which I thought was fascinating. Some of the problems that you guys have been talking about, this is what other industries are talking about too. Transparency. How do you mitigate fraud? How do you create efficiencies in supply chains? How do you get lots of different people to work together who sit in different places? These are just a few that I've mentioned here that I think are interesting from an other sector standpoint. But I'm really here to talk about aviation. And when I think about aviation, I think about a couple things. And I've actually grouped them differently than you might have imagined. People, supply chain logistics, safety, security, and regulation. And I'll explain a little bit why I've grouped it this way. People, at the heart of everything we do, this needs to be human-centric tech. And that's actually one of the things that, as GBC, we spend a lot of time on, which is how can this technology be used to help people? People do not get erased from the equation just because we have technology. If anything, it should be an enhancement. So identity management is a major access point, and some people would argue it's the gateway for how blockchain is going to work. And if that's the case, then the aviation industry has the identities of all of its customers, its suppliers, its partners, et cetera, et cetera. How is that going to be managed? Will it be managed with open standards? Will it be managed by closed networks? I think that's still a big debate. Tokenization, I'll give you an example of that in a little bit. We're talking about loyalty miles, effectively, or loyalty points turning into tokens. It's really no more than that. But then when you do that, can you make it fungible, i.e., can you use your miles from one place to another place, and does that then become more valuable? Because now you can move your miles around. That's a pretty cool concept. I think from a user end standpoint, people would love that. From a practical industry standpoint, how do you make that happen? And how do you make money off of that? And there's also a gaming element to that as well. Bundled services, what we mean by that is as you improve your customer experience, can you then, and it's already happening, right? Can you then include the insurance piece? Do you automatically include the housing or the transportation piece on the ground when someone lands to their destination and coming back? Can you bundle all those things together in a seamless experience? Potentially. Supply chain logistics. Again, identity is a major issue. So here's one I got from Metals and Mining, believe it or not. One of their big issues is people come to their site with outdated credentials. And because it's manually done, people don't always check that someone's credentials have expired the month before, the week before. And if they could automate that, that would actually help them to reduce some of the people who get access to their mining sites who shouldn't have access. And so, you know, from a aviation standpoint, could you have better credentialing done, more up-to-date credentialing? Could that be managed in a more efficient, effective way? Real-time track and trace. I think we've heard talk about there is some level of fraud in supply chain. There's probably some level of fraud mitigation that can occur, like in aviation insurance, maybe even in trade financing or leasing. There's areas where people find that if you could do real-time track and trace, could you make it more efficient? Data analytics, again, this is all about data. I think that was mentioned a few times this morning. The winners of data in today and tomorrow's world, the source of data, nobody else can get it but you because you're the source. The distributors of the data, because you've got the best distribution, or the analytics. You run the best analytics of all that rubbish that's out there, all of the data. Can you actually mine for the nuggets of gold or the gems that people actually want in terms of the information? I think there's still a lot to do there, and that's where AI also comes in. Aircraft leasing and insurance, I'm going to talk less about that, but that's, again, discussions that come up around how can financial services help make aviation more effective and efficient. Safety, security, and regulation, I think that has a lot more to do with how do you bring the regulator into your network. So I don't know if there are any regulators actually in the room, but what if the regulator could be a node in the network? So instead of this pushing out of information all the time, what if the regulator is already in the network and actually receives pieces of data as you go along, instead of the push and pull? And believe it or not, this is a very common thematic in a lot of heavily regulated industries, where the regulator now comes into the network and is part of the process, as opposed to sort of waiting and receiving. Data sharing, again, I mentioned a lot about data. We will talk about whether blockchain could help kill some of the bureaucracy. I think actually what you guys mentioned before about regulation and people's behavior changing has a lot to do with it as well. If people don't want to change and sectors don't want to change, it's pretty hard to digitize stuff. And then insurance and financing. So let's talk about identity management. I want to mention to you ID 2020, if you are not familiar. There are a number of large firms like Accenture and Microsoft who have signed up. It's an open standards network that is trying to be created around digital identity. Now, most of the digital identity we'll talk about here are individuals, but I would imagine in a future world where even institutions, your partners, your companies all have digital identities, and that data is managed and owned by the sovereign self or the sovereign institution. And the idea that we turn the model of who owns data on its head. So the idea of a Facebook is inverted, meaning the individual or the institution that's actually creating the data owns the data. These ideas are obviously in experimental stages. There are lots of business models being tested right now, but the idea around self-sovereign identity is not new. It's been around for a number of years. The question is, who is going to actually help keep a world where if that is open, who's going to manage that? Will it be a regulatory body? Will it be like a UN of identities? Will it be governments? And let's keep in mind, the developing nations have a very different problem than developed. Developed, we all have our own government-issued IDs. In the developing nations, they don't have identities. They don't have cards. They don't have any reflection in documentation form of who they are, where they are. And think about the refugee crisis right now. How many people have identities? And that's a major issue. So we've got two actually different sets of problems in those categories. Let's talk about a fun, I think this is a great idea. I don't know if anyone from Lufthansa or SAP are in the room, but this is a great way for a company, if you're not sure where to start, is you actually launch a challenge. And so they effectively launched a hackathon stroke startup challenge in 2018, and these winners were just announced. They had 3 different challenges, and they basically asked for startups to apply and solve for certain problems. So the airline challenge winner, 500 Labs, was solving for flight operations efficiency. So the connectivity between airports, airlines, logistics on the ground. Could you help turnaround times? When things go wrong, could you actually help remove inefficiencies? And so that they are one of the winners. And then, or they were the winner, and for that category, Traveler Challenge winner. Sweetbridge, I'm actually familiar with this group. They are a financial services marketplace using a blockchain and decentralized. They are, I believe they focused on loyalty points and loyalty miles and how to create a marketplace for that. I think that's a pretty obvious one and one that could actually be quite profitable. Supplier challenge. That was, as you may think, it's around how do you make supply chains more efficient. And I'm going to talk about 14 BIS supply tracking a little bit more here. So this is something where I've learned a lot too because I'm not as familiar with the aviation space. It didn't occur to me that there could be counterfeit parts, but apparently there are. 2%, in fact, according to their figures, which equate to about 1.92 billion a year of money lost. So counterfeiting, albeit it's a small percentage, it's enough where the numbers are fairly significant. And that's just the US market from my understanding, or North American market. And they're looking to help reduce that. Now here's the problem. Blockchain doesn't solve for fraud. Blockchain doesn't solve for bad human behavior. I think in a network, we should always assume somebody's a bad actor and somebody is always going to try to cheat the system. The problem in supply chains most days, or these days, is the fact that not that there are cheaters. It's hard to find the cheaters quickly and then extract them or punish them in the network. So the faster you can do that, the more money you can save, and actually, hopefully, over time, it's a deterrent. I'm only showing you this because it took me a while to figure out, wow, every supply chain schematic, whether it's aviation, by the way, or whether we're talking about heavy industry or consumer products, it looks a lot like this, just different names. But the problems being, if you really break down every piece of the supply chain, there are so many players. And so much of it is either on paper or not automated, let alone potentially on Excel spreadsheets, hopefully, that they manage to move around. But the point being is that fragmentation that you guys talk about in aviation is the same across pretty much every sector I've spoken to regarding supply chains. So what can distributed ledger do? What distributed ledger or blockchain can do, and by the way, I'm using the terms liberally. Some purists might have a hard time with me doing that, but for argument's sake here, I'm just going to use blockchain and distributed ledger interchangeably. The idea of being able to share the same set of records while protecting certain pieces of information. So imagine this. It's a data bank. All the data is in one big network, and each individual player here, like for example, would get access to different pieces of it. But the key point is that as one piece of data enters the network, everyone's ledger is updated. So if one entire vertical were to collapse, you still have a record. And you're not vulnerable to the single source failure because it's distributed. Now, what's the downside? Of course, the more people you have in the network and the more you replicate, the more you end up with potentially slow systems, which people are working on how to make it faster. So Boeing, I'm giving you this example here. It's my last one because my favorite way of figuring out what companies are doing, two things. I check out what patents they're filing, and I also go to their jobs opening site or section. I've been doing that a lot for Facebook lately. And you go check out who they're hiring and where they're hiring. You learn a lot about a company when you look at those two things. Sure, there's lots of other things to look at, but those are two things that I look for. And so Boeing made an interesting patent filing with respect to blockchain. And it's interesting to me that people underestimate companies, even though they're not public about it, they do a lot of patent filings oftentimes, a lot of the big companies. And so where you can often see where they might be going is what sort of the brains are doing inside of a given organization. So this one was really around creating an onboard backup and anti-spoofing GPS system based on blockchain. So basically, if the airplane's primary system failed, they'd have a backup on the ground effectively. And that's a pretty interesting idea. I mean, we'll see if that actually comes to fruition, but the patent's been filed and it's in process. So I mentioned a couple things about the benefits of blockchain. I think a lot of people talk about, oh, it will help you reduce costs, it will help you to share information, it's going to, solve world hunger. No, it won't. But I think what we need to understand here is this is really two things. One, it's a transparency and fraud mitigation play. So meaning if you need transparency in different parts of your business, this is a great way to do it. And also, we don't know yet what the opportunities are, but it's already creating a potentially multi-trillion-dollar sector itself. Meaning, if you think about how many people have jobs related to blockchain in the last 2 years on LinkedIn versus, by the way, I've been in it for about 6 years. From 6 years ago, the growth is phenomenal. And there is more money coming into the sector every year. And I think the latest statistics show that financial services will get the bulk of the investment this year, but other industries are going up that S-curve. And there will be massive investments happening in various sectors, like the 5 that I mentioned, plus aviation. Supply chain is a big one. I don't even think we understand what the implications are really, truly. We're at the kind of beginning of this. And again, I see risks. There's a lot of different things that are problematic right now. I don't think any of us should think that like somehow it's all done. It's not. But some of the brightest minds in the world are working on this, which is why I feel pretty heartened that it's being built. It will take longer than probably most people would like. But again, when you're talking about core infrastructure, it can take a long time. So there we are. I wanted to thank you. I only had a few minutes, or 15 minutes. I wanted to make sure that I covered as much as I could. If there are any questions, I'm happy to take, I think, maybe 1 or 2.
Great. Thank you very much. So one of the questions, which I think a lot of these are probably focused on mining of Bitcoin and more, but eVTOLs, new fuel programs are all focused on reducing business aviation's energy footprint. Blockchain uses insane amounts of energy. How do we reconcile?
So I'm going to have to bust some myths here. Okay. Myth number 1, all blockchains do mining. Absolutely not. That is absolutely categorically false. Bitcoin does use proof of work, which is the term for the mining. And yes, the amount of energy used for mining Bitcoins has been very high, but what's also propelled the industry is they're now moving towards and have moved towards thermal energy and more green energy usage. So if you look at where mining is occurring, Canada, Iceland, Norway, it's very interesting to see the migration path of where a lot of the mining is happening. But yes, Bitcoin mining, yes, but not the other blockchains.
How does blockchain protect its users from fraud when the system that transmits the data is hacked?
So a couple things. One is, by the way, rubbish data in, rubbish data out. So if you've got bad data, there's nothing blockchain's going to do to help you other than record that bad data. So what you want to have is good data in, that good data agreed amongst this network. I hate to say this to you guys, but if we have bad data in this room and every single one of you agrees to lock in this data, then what's going on with this group, right? So there are mechanisms in place that should allow you to throw out bad data or not confirm that bad data. The whole point about blockchain is that you lock in the data that is agreed and true. It's a source of truth, as some people call it. In terms of the system getting hacked, okay, a couple things. One, the Bitcoin blockchain's been around for, and it was the first, it's been around for over 10 years now. It's never actually been hacked. What's happened is not because it hasn't tried to, people have tried to hack it. What have been hacked are the exchanges, the wallets, the points of what I call weak points of entry in the system where people have concentrated the Bitcoin. That's different than the actual system. Now, the argument that some of the purists will make is that in a public blockchain, you have lots of developers around the world working to secure this blockchain publicly. If you do a private permission blockchain, you're only as good as that walled garden you've created, and therefore, again, vulnerable to whoever the weakest link is in this room. So there's a lot of arguments around why public chains are stronger than private chains, but again, to be debated.
Are there low entry points or low hanging fruit for distributed ledgers or
Yeah.
blockchain?
Yeah. I think if there's any area where it needs to go digital anyway, like it's paper or Excel, if it needs to go digital and there's no existing infrastructure, because existing infrastructure is where people dig their heels in and they don't want to change because they've spent the money and they're kind of used to their systems. If there's any area where there's fertile ground for it to move to a new infrastructure, that's where the low-hanging fruit is, because you get the least path of resistance.
And how does a private network not end up becoming centralized?
It's hard. Humans have this really strange desire to centralize stuff. I had a regulator once tell me, not in aviation, but in financial services, it's like, I don't want to be part of a network. I'm like, but you get the transparency, you get all the data. Yeah, but I want to go to someone and make them do the work so I can see it. Literally, that's what was said to me. I said, all right, I get it. That's why you like clearinghouses. But I think what we need to do is to work out what is the right mix. Is it a truly decentralized world? Probably not in the business sector. I have a feeling it's a hybrid. It will be more decentralization with lots of different actors doing different responsibilities that maybe today one company does. Maybe we break it out. So the functions remain the same, but different companies or different actors in the network do those roles. And I think that could build resilience. But let's be frank here. I think humanity generally likes to have some forms of centralization. So we'll probably end up with hubs that will do some more of the work and aggregate some of the stuff. But the idea is that if we could create a data bank that is shared amongst the entire network, that will help facilitate anyone who wants to build on it more freely. And that's one of the frictions right now is you have some data, I have some data, you have some data. It would be really great if we shared it, but we don't share it right now because it's stupid systems that don't talk to each other. Let's face it.
Or it's people not wanting to share the data, like
right.
this question.
Okay.
How does blockchain work in a highly competitive industry?
Yeah, so this is where the financial services industry has also had to change its tune. In the old days, and this is where I grew up, so I'll talk about it from where I stand, everything was build it yourself. Banks built everything themselves. They had armies of developers. Everything had to be built themselves in-house. This concept around open source or using code that's open was just a foreign concept altogether. But today, some of the biggest proponents of adopting open source now are the banks and market infrastructure, shockingly enough. That's a behavioral change, and I think what people have realized is you can have actually more value at the top levels. It's the applications, it's the new businesses that you create because you allowed for the base layer, which is commoditized anyway, to actually be open.
Do we have any old-fashioned questions with microphones? Two last questions then. I think this is like, what are great B2B blockchains that you have encountered?
Companies, I imagine? Okay. There are a couple of projects that are happening right now, but again, I will caveat this and say there's a lot of experimentation going on, and I don't know whether the companies I'm listing right now are going to be Netscape or they're going to be Google. But you've got Digital Asset is working with the Australian Stock Exchange to actually take out their entire back-end settlement system. Includes payments, by the way, settlement and confirmation of reports. That's mission-critical stuff for an exchange. And they've been working since 2015. It will go live, estimated first quarter, second quarter, 2021. And so that replacement, Digital Asset, is a company out of New York that is working with financial services.
Okay, you've actually got hundreds of questions, so I'm going to let you choose your... I think I have lots of data. How do I start a blockchain? I'm guessing isn't a 1-minute answer.
I would actually beg you, please don't start another blockchain. There are too many. Find one that fits. No, look, I think it's right. You start with your business problem. And I'll be very frank with you. I just had a conversation with someone, and I did tell them, you don't need a blockchain. What are you doing? You really don't need a blockchain for this. Because they had trusted parties. There were only a couple of them, and they already like share their information fairly easily, and it was actually not a very complicated business. So my view was like, are you just doing blockchain because you think you need a blockchain? Blockchain works best when there's multiple parties that need to share. There may be full trust, there may not actually be full trust, but the idea is that they don't have to worry about that because the network itself will ensure the data integrity, provided you've got the right architecture.
Okay, final question, because you've answered loads. Are we in the trough of disillusionment for blockchain? This is someone who bought a lot of Bitcoin.
Yeah. I'm going to separate the speculation side from the actual technology side. If you were part of crypto winter, I'm sorry. Yes, you've probably suffered. But again, that is always going to be, there's cycles to every market. And yes, that one was brutal. And if you have some dry powder, maybe you want to go in now. I don't know. But anyway, I'm not going to sit here and speculate. For those who are on the technology side and looking at the technology itself, there are a lot of really cool advancements happening. Questions around scalability, how do you keep privacy, how do you keep confidentiality, how do you prevent bad actors from doing very bad things in the system. These are things that, and scalability, people are working on these things and they're making headway. What I love, some of the best use cases out there right now are micropayments. If you can move around $1 and pay less than a penny, wouldn't that be cool? Because in certain countries, $1 actually is a lot. And what if you could move it almost frictionlessly? Micropayments is a big deal because you could actually start solving for cross-border remittance. And there was actually a discussion earlier in the panel today about you guys settling your payments because the banks are too slow and they like to apparently take the weekend off. Well, guess what? What if you had your own internal settlement token where basically you would recognize in the network that this is good. It's as good as cash. And you could get a bank to work with you to basically credit the on and off ramp, meaning when you need the sterling or the dollars. You could literally settle every one of your transactions in your network instantly, record that, and then when you need the quote unquote sterling or fiat currency, you could then work with that bank to have that on ramp. My view is that's an instant way to like simplify your lives from a payments standpoint. So no, we're not at a trough of disillusionment in the technology side, actually. I think people should get really, really excited.
Brilliant. And on that cheery note, thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.